Hello and welcome to episode 29 of a Plain Accounts web series where every week we discuss at least one of this Sunday's lectionary passages. I, Danny Quanstrom, am here with Ben Kramer. Ben, do you want to say hello?
Hey, it's good to be here as always.
And we have with us Mark Walker. Mark, would you say hello? Tell us a little bit about yourself and where you are, how you're serving.
Sure. Hi, my name is Mark Walker. I'm pastor at a church, Nazarene Church in Lansing, Michigan, and I've been here 8.5 years. I also serve as our district secretary, so it's a little interesting passage for me this week. I was preparing a passage I will not be preaching, but our assembly begins later this week, so good times.
Yeah, it's funny how often that happens, that people write commentaries for passages they're not preaching that Sunday. It happens quite often, actually. Well, Mark, great to have you here. Mark is my district secretary, so I'll be seeing you in just a few short days at District Assembly. Today we're here to discuss the passage that Mark wrote about, which is Luke 10:25 through 37. As Mark wrote, perhaps the most well-known passage in all of the Bible, if not just the New Testament. So I'm going to go ahead and read these verses as recorded in the New Revised Standard Version. The parable of the Good Samaritan. Just then a lawyer stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he said, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" He said to him, "What is written in the law? What do you read there?" He answered, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." And he said to him, "You have given the right answer. Do this and you will live." But wanting to justify himself, he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" Jesus replied, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell into the hands of robbers, who stripped him, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. Now by chance a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, while traveling, came near him, and when he saw him, was moved with pity. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, having poured oil and wine on them. Then he put him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper, and said, 'Take care of him, and when I come back I will repay you whatever more you spend.' Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers?" He said, "The one who showed him mercy." Jesus said to him, "Go and do likewise." This is the written word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Okay, so okay, we don't need to say anything. We all know the passage, right? We're good to go. Yes, episode ever, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So, Mark, one of the things you wrote that I thought was really good, you said a parable is like a joke. If you have to explain the parts to it, it loses something. You said something to that effect.
Yeah.
And I thought that was an apt metaphor there. As somebody who loves a good dad joke, I appreciated that metaphor. But we've got to preach this. So what do we need to know? What is important in this passage? Perhaps without dissecting it too much, so we don't lose it. But what's going on here?
I think.
Well,
one of the-
I've been working through the Luke passages in the lectionary, and I've just been struck with this idea of Jesus being on the way to Jerusalem, and just that he's in this journey here that is more about not the location as much as what it means, where he's going and where he's taking his people, what it means to follow Christ on the way. And so that this passage is stuck in the middle of this journey towards Jerusalem, and so a lot of it is about how we live this life as a follower of Christ, as a follower of the way, how we live this out. And there's so much in this passage that is great and wonderful, that I guess I gave that analogy because you kind of start going into it and you could explain all these little things and forget to take notice of the big picture here. He's kind of set us up with this idea of love God with all of who you are and love your neighbor, and he's starting to demonstrate for us what that looks like through this story that we find that catches us off guard. At least it would if we weren't so familiar with it.
Right. Absolutely. And Ben, what were you going to say?
Well, I think right along with that, it's the catching us off guard that I think is an important component to not lose from this passage. And I think maybe one of the big things that the preacher's task would be on Sunday is to make sure that they understand how offensive it would be to use a Samaritan in such a favorable light. Um, I think many of our congregants will come in with the perception, well, the Samaritan's already good because Luke told us. That's what the Bible says. The Samaritan's good, and they won't understand how marginalized and how the hostility between Jews and Samaritans, how they really, before I even went to undergrad, did I know that Samaritans were Torah followers. They just disagreed with the Jews that came back from Babylonian exile because they thought that sort of Judaism changed. And so they're cousins from the tribe of Ephraim. They they if anybody has, it's a family dispute, which is why they have such hostility between the two. But maybe comparing the Samaritan with other people groups in our contemporary society that we've put in very unfavorable light, and maybe retelling this parable using a homosexual, or using somebody who's directly offensive to our state of what is good, because Jesus applies the term good to this Samaritan, and then getting the full effect of how it might hit the original Jewish audience, I think might be an important component in preaching this passage.
I found myself going there. I'm sorry, I found myself going there originally myself too. As I was working on this passage, I was thinking of an intersection near my home where, when I get off the freeway, virtually every time I get off the freeway there's someone holding a sign saying, "Anything helps, God bless you." And in fact, I drove by there on the 4th of July, and there was nobody standing there, maybe because there was no one on the road, but there was a stack of the cardboard signs next to the pole where people stand. And I usually drive by there, and I just try to focus on when the light's going to turn green instead of focusing on who's standing there. And I've thought to myself, you're just writing "God bless you" because you want my money. And I mean, that's just personally where I found myself thinking some about this. And I don't have a tendency to think. My tendency to think is, I would have something to offer this person. This person could never have anything to offer me. But quite honestly, I've never taken the time to try to get to know them to find out,
Right.
one way or the other, what's true. And so I was thinking about that, and I was thinking about a couple of things. One of the elements of this passage I was thinking about is what it means to have compassion, to suffer with, to enter into relationship with someone that might cause us some discomfort, that might be risky, all of those things. But on the other hand, I was thinking too, I didn't want to just redefine who a neighbor was today, because I think we can, again, narrow that down so much. My neighbor's just that homeless person that everybody in my congregation knows because they see him too, when maybe my neighbor is somebody else as well. And so I was a little hesitant, some because of that, to try to make some sort of a connection today, whether that's a homeless person or someone who's homosexual or whatever else kind of a thing we might want to be. I was just a little hesitant there. And perhaps there's some value there of exegeting your congregation, to know where your congregation is and how you need to challenge them or stretch them too.
Well, I think using the homeless person on the side of the road is a good example is that I was just preaching about this on our Sunday night service, that we have a very instantaneous definition of compassion. We see maybe going and getting a meal for a homeless person and dropping it off. We've done our act for compassion, or giving them a gift card, or giving them money. When the Samaritan spent a whole day with this person, and stayed at the inn with him, and then got up the next morning and said, "I'm going to continue on my way. Here's money for the rest of his care." Like, we don't spend even over like a 5-minute interaction in our acts of compassion, when Jesus is really showing an act of compassion that's relational. It's something that you build within relationship with a person. And in Boise, Idaho, our mayor just came out with a huge declaration to the city: do not help panhandlers at all. Do not give them anything, because they are completely in disregard to the Boise Rescue Mission, all three of our major services that are there to help. They are rejecting those things citywide because they're not allowed to drink, they're not allowed to have sex, they're not allowed to do whatever they want in those missions. So they'd rather panhandle and stay in the streets than take advantage of these services. So, like, how are we showing true compassion in relationship, knowing their context and actually helping in the most loving, Christ-like way?
I want to flip the script on this one a little bit, because I believe it was Soren Kierkegaard who was writing about this. Jesus has just sent out the disciples, right? He's just sent out the 70 or the 72 to go and proclaim peace and proclaim the kingdom of God. And it's kind of about being the agents who provide something for someone else. But I want to look at this one, and the logic of this passage is incredible, because I think Jesus is not saying, go and do likewise like the Samaritan. He's saying, go and do likewise like the man who's been beaten. Because in the logic of the parable, what does this lawyer ask Jesus? Who is my neighbor? Who is my neighbor? That's the formative question. And then Jesus tells this parable, and then at the very end, Jesus says back to the lawyer, who was this man's neighbor? He asks the question back. He doesn't say to Jesus, you are like the Levite, you are like the priest, or you are like the Samaritan. Jesus says to the lawyer, you are like the man who's been beaten and left for dead. Who was this man's neighbor? He asks the same question back to the guy. And the man says, well, the one who showed mercy on him. So Jesus says, go and do likewise. So here, the man, the lawyer who asked the question, is not the agent doing the activity. He's the one receiving the help. Go and do likewise. Receive grace even from Samaritans. Receive hospitality even from your blacklist family members. Receive compassion. Don't reject the compassion of somebody simply because they're a Samaritan or because they're homeless or because whatever these categories that we're describing. The logic of this parable is it turns the tables completely. We want to think that we're the ones like the priest, the Levite, and the Samaritan. We're the ones that we have it together. We have the resources. We've got it taken care of. But Jesus says, no, you, lawyer, are left for dead. Who is your neighbor? Who is the one showing compassion to you? Who is the one bandaging your wounds and carrying them?
That's a lot.
And so it's completely switched. I mean, this lawyer is not the one who's in control, which, I mean, as a Jewish lawyer, I mean, he's a man of prestige. He's got it together, but he said he's the one left for dead. Which is kind of an insult to this Jewish lawyer, that the Samaritan would be the one who has it together and the lawyer isn't. Especially as, Mark, you wrote in your essay that the disciples have just come back to Jesus and said, should we call down fire from heaven on Samaria? Like, they've not accepted you. They have been inhospitable to you. Should we call down fire on them? And now in this story, Jesus is telling about a Samaritan who is the only one who's being hospitable. So I just think there are some very fun ways, some very interesting ways to apply this. And Mark, I like how you talked about how the Levite and the priest, I mean, these guys, they had very justifiable reasons for not helping this guy. There were, I mean, if they're going to if they are on religious, if they have religious duties and they help this man, well, then they become unclean. So they have legitimate reasons for not helping this guy out. And so, yeah. Anyway, I'm kind of spewing at this point. So I'm going to pass it off to you guys. Some more thoughts on the content of this passage. Before then, for a few minutes, we talk about, okay, so what? So how do we preach it?
Yeah, one of the things I was thinking about too with compassion, I mentioned that idea a little bit earlier, compassion, and besides just the Samaritan, I mean, Danny, with what you're saying, I think there are the two sides. I mean, we could easily be the person in the ditch who is blessed by this person they would least expect. And I guess when I said the thing about the people holding the signs, God bless you, it made me think about, normally I think, yeah, you're just doing that because you want something from me, because surely I have something to offer to you, and what could you have to offer to me? But then in the sense, the very nature of grace is that it's undeserved too.
Right.
But on the other side with the Samaritan, the compassion was more than just, here's this person who hates me that I'm going to go out of my way to care for, to spend my money on, all of those things. I mean, he was literally in the story physically risking of himself, because this could have very well just been some sort of ruse by robbers to try to get someone to stop, to let their guard down and get attacked themselves. And so he was literally risking his own safety and well-being by stopping to help this person with no apparent regard for that. He just does that as well, which is kind of, again, not what we like to think of when we think of compassion. We think of, a bit like Ben was saying, those acts of charity, rather than this relational act that is quite costly in many different ways.
Yeah, I mean, financially, and I mean, Samaria, and he's going on the opposite side of the road. He crosses the road to help this man.
Yeah.
That he was going somewhere. He had an agenda. But what does he do? He bandaged his wounds, and he brought him to an inn. And so he went. I mean, his whole agenda has been transformed. He's going, presumably, back to where he came from to take care of this guy. Yeah, so compassion.
I think going back to what the lawyer said about, he quotes Deuteronomy and Leviticus, and the vocabulary there is almost a passive sense, like it's already been done. I've already loved my neighbor. I've already achieved that part of the law, because he's seeing it through a very sequential order. Like, that's the primary one, but I've already done all of those things. Where Christ is trying to say, it's already assumed that everyone is your neighbor. The question is, how will you show compassion to them? How will you go and show mercy? And some commentators have even said he's making the Samaritan out to be a Christ figure, to mirror himself, and then that's who you're supposed to imitate. Compassion and mercy only come from God. So, and everyone has been created in the image of this God. So how are you going to show compassion? That is your goal. It's not to distinguish who is your neighbor. You should assume that everyone's your neighbor, because everyone's created in the image of God. So it's, how will you show compassion and mercy in this relational, self-giving, agenda-altering way? this extreme show of compassion.
Okay, so in the last few minutes, let's talk about homiletical handles, ways we can make this passage appropriate or relevant to our congregations. How do you preach it? In the last 5 minutes or so, what are ways that we should preach this?
Well, I think, since this is such a well-known passage of Scripture, I think that's hard in some ways, because, how do we help people in our congregation maybe see something through fresh eyes, or see themselves in something through fresh eyes, or allow themselves to be engaged with this? The question isn't so much who is my neighbor, but how can I be a neighbor to anyone I come in contact with. And I think ultimately trying to respond in that kind of way where we act as a neighbor with everybody we come in contact with is not something we can just accomplish on our own. It's not something that through willpower or through niceness we can do and be. To be a person who is neighborly is an act of God in us. And so how do we humbly allow God to continue that transforming work in us, where our attitudes, our mindset continues to be transformed, so that we don't just see people as if they're our neighbor, but we act neighborly in situations whenever they present themselves. And so I think that there's this element again here of this surrender before God. I think the passage I'm working on for this the next one too is with Martha and Mary, where there's an element of in addition to the going, doing, the sitting and listening, the sitting and being, and how do these two things go together in living our faith out as well? I think the Good Samaritan and Mary and Martha, you read them together, and they hold themselves together, that help us wrestle with this. How do we live in the tension between these elements of our faith? And so how do we help our people live that out wherever that is in their own lives? And I guess I mentioned briefly earlier, I think that's some of the exegeting your congregation to say,
Right.
who's here? How are they going to hear this? How do they need to hear this?
Yeah, absolutely. It's so well known that there's this assumption that we all know it fully, so it makes it a little bit more difficult to preach,
Right.
perhaps.
Yeah.
I think there's we haven't mentioned it, but I think even talking about some of the law, there's you could, obviously we know Jesus is going to tell this story about what it means to be a neighbor, so we're maybe thinking a little bit along those lines of some sort of niceness or love, but there's still a legitimate reason for the priest and the Levite to not act towards this fellow Jew. But on the flip side, if you have a Samaritan who is following God's ways, in a legal sense, a Jew is not their neighbor. So they're not obliged to act towards this person. And so it's this sort of expanding nature of what it means to be a part of the kingdom, that it's not about following these boundaries of how we live out our faith. It's this trying to be like Christ in all of who we are. I don't know how that fits in at this point in the conversation. I was just thinking of that a minute ago too. So
Yeah.
Sure.
Well, and go ahead, Ben.
No, I sometimes get in trouble, as my congregation will tell you, because I try to put myself so much into how the context of the story was presented, and in this one, Jesus doesn't care who he offends in what he's saying here, and I think it has to have offended the lawyer and his Jewish audience in a sense to get the point across, because it would have, given what James and John have already said about how they feel about Samaritans, it would have offended everybody just by using Samaritan in such a good light. So maybe some offense in our sermons is mandatory, to try to get this, to see that in fresh eyes. We believe the Samaritan to be good because we know the story so well. But what if we put, Syrian immigrants, or, using someone that is kind of legally on the, well, I don't know how I'm supposed to help this person, or, be even helped by these people, and using offense as a exegetical and preaching homiletical tool to try to get people to say, hey, this sort of compassion may be outside of our comfort zone, but this is what, who do we want to call lightning down on? Like, who are those people in our society that we'd rather see just gone from the earth than go and help or be helped by? because that's exactly what the disciples wanted to do, and we are disciples. So how are we to show compassion in this new way and bring it around after you've kind of jarred them a little bit by, this isn't the nice fluffy precious moments Bible story that I've always remembered it to be. I want it's a little bit more rough to take in.
But
Yeah,
offensive because of how far-reaching the compassion is.
Yes.
Like that, not offensive because it's gratuitous or because it's
Right,
mean-spirited. It's offensive because of it's too inclusive.
Yeah.
You can include the Samaritans with them. They're not my neighbor.
Mm-hmm.
It's too radical. It's too gracious. It's too compassionate. That's what's offensive. Is there anything that we would think is too compassionate?
I found myself too, Ben. I also thought about the Syrian refugees at one point when I was working on this too. But I think there's a much more personal and local or congregational connection for a lot of us with this too, because it's easy for me to talk about the Syrian refugees because honestly I've never come across one in Lansing, even though I know we have a few here, but I've never encountered them, so it's easy for me to talk about that. I can probably say this because I'm certain there's no one from my congregation watching this, but a few years back at our church, it's been some years back now at our church, we were saying, we really want to reach out to this trailer park that's a half mile from us. We would love to reach out to them. And then one Sunday, just before Christmas, it was our children's Christmas program, and we'd started connecting with a few kids from there, and these kids all invited their families. And so we probably have 20 or 30 people from the trailer park who don't look like us or smell like us or talk like us, and they're all in the service. And the week before, one of our long-standing Sunday school classes said, we're going to have a potluck, and we'll invite all the guests to come that day. It'll be kind of our class Christmas party, but we'll have food to invite people who come for the children's Christmas program. And then all these people show up. And before service, I heard someone say, what's up with all the white trash here today? And then during the potluck afterwards, I heard discussion amongst some of the class members say, next year we need to make sure that we either do our class party somewhere else or that we don't do it on the day when we have guests with us so we don't have to share our food with them. And I found myself thinking, these are the same people that when they weren't here we were saying we wanted to reach, but now that they're here we're struggling with. Now, that would not happen today in our congregation, but for us, it's one thing to say, yeah, those are our neighbors, we have to reach them. It's another thing when we actually have to do there. And those people certainly don't carry some of the marks of a Syrian refugee or a homosexual or whatever else these things we like to do. They were just the people who didn't bathe and who didn't dress nice and who talked kind of funny and just didn't fit in with us. But it was the question for us is how are we going to be neighbors to these people who quite literally are our neighbors in many ways.
I really like the trajectory of that, Mark, because using kind of how close, Samaritans were cousins. They were people in their local context that they didn't accept because of little disagreements that they had in worship. And like that's church. Like we have disagreements over the way music should sound or the way the sanctuary should look and things like that. So if we can't show compassion to the people sitting in the pews next to us or guests that come in, they may not fit it into our schema, then how do we expect to go out and show compassion to those who are even more offensive to our sensibilities and our lines of who the neighbor should be? That's really good.
Yeah, sometimes we feel good about ourselves when there's people who are really in trouble that, hey, we're really helping these people. And sometimes it's the people who maybe aren't quite far out there that we have a harder time with. There are some folks who left our church with a big brouhaha, whatever, and they'd shown up for a couple of special events a few years back, and somebody said, Pastor, what are we going to do if they want to come back? So what do you mean, what are we going to do? We're going to welcome them back. Sometimes there's that we have that mentality of if you disagree with me, you're my enemy, or if you were once a part of us and chose to leave, come back again. And sometimes those are the harder places to be neighborly than someone who seems so far out there for us.
Yeah.
And so where is that, and where are we at with those things? And it can be all over.
Because if they're not going to accept Samaritans who were Jews before Babylonian exile, how the heck are they going to accept Gentiles when it comes to the time to bring them into the kingdom? And
Sure.
That's sort of the same question that we're going to ask our people on Sunday.
Yeah.
Yeah, friends, there's so much going on here. This is such a rich passage. Maybe for good reason it's the most well-known. Maybe there's a good reason it is. Maybe there's a reason the term Good Samaritan has entered our social vernacular. It's a part of our typical language. And maybe there's a good reason for that, because it's such a rich text and there's so much going on. I think there's a lot we could continue to discuss. But for time's sake, we'll cut the episode short. For further reading, check out Mark's essay, his contribution to A Plain Account at aplainaccount.org. Check it out. Do either of you have one final word before we close this episode?
Go and do the same.
Go and do likewise. What does the Lord require of you?
That's right. Very good. Thank you for your time today, Mark. Thanks for writing. Thanks for speaking with us today. We know you're busy, especially these days, so we thank you for the time that you've taken out to join us. Make sure to like our Facebook page, follow us on Twitter. You know the deal. I don't need to go through all of that. You know what's up. But if you haven't, what's going on? Check it out. We've got good stuff on there, so you need to be up to date with A Plain Account, because we've got some great stuff in the works. Ben, great to see you. Mark, thanks again for joining. You guys take care and have a wonderful, wonderful rest of your week. Thank you for watching today. Grace and peace.
You as well.